Great. So Bikram, I think
I think you can begin. Yeah,
we can start now. I'll just do a quick intro. If you can keep letting people in, that's great, and then I'll take over from you when you're.
I will do. You please.
Thank you. Yes. So my name's Nicky Saunter. I'm sorry I can't change my name on there because it doesn't seem to let me, because I'm the host at the moment, unless someone can tell me otherwise. And I work for an organisation called the Rapid Transition Alliance, which is based in the UK, but is a group of organisations across the world now, which is fantastic. We have about 160 people, 160 organisations, and many people. And we also work through regional sort of hubs and particularly strong partners in different regions. So Bikram at JNU is our regional partner for India and South Asia. And it's been a pleasure to work with him and to organise this conversation, as we're calling them. We've been having a series of conversations about consumption, and we will also be having a series of conversations about sustainable transport, those being two enormous issues at the moment in our search for ways to live sustainably in the future. We have had events in Africa, thanks to our partners in Kenya, and we're currently organising events with new partners in South America. And in a couple of weeks' time, we'll be having, actually it's next week, we'll be having our first global event, bringing together people from the different regions to talk about their different and shared experiences on these same topics, which I'm particularly looking forward to. It's always very interesting to hear people talk about, find out what actually is sometimes very similar in the challenges, even though our cultures and environments are so different. Quick plug actually for our Alliance network. Seeing as we have I have so many people here who I've not met before, we're always looking to expand the Alliance, and it's free to join. It's simply a platform where people who are working towards the Paris goals of keeping this planet below 1.5 degrees of global warming come together to share information, to hold events, and to amplify each other's work. So the idea is that we try to tell everybody in the Alliance about what you're doing. We try to encourage people to connect with each other and to collaborate with each other where possible. And also we just get to know each other, which is great. And we're looking, this body of work at the moment is done within the context of the global pandemic, and horrific though it has been for many people and tragic personally for many, it's also in some ways brought us together. And this kind of event is an example of that, how we've been, maybe we've trained ourselves to work better virtually and remotely. And that's had some really positive effect in bringing us together and enabling these sorts of events. So a very big welcome and a big thank you to all of our panelists who've agreed to speak today. We really look forward to hearing from you, and also to everyone who's turned up to participate and to watch. We're going to have after my intro, Bikram will take over and host the event with our speakers, who will all speak for a short time each. And then we will ask people to use the chat to put questions, and I will be looking for those questions, and then ask you to unmute yourself, because I think we don't have such massive numbers. We can ask you to unmute yourself and ask your question if you would like to, or I can ask the question on your behalf to the panelists. And we really encourage people to participate. This is meant to be a conversation, not a series of speeches. So we really look forward to this being a great event, and we'll be rounding up at 11 o'clock. So over to Bikram. I'll take over the admitting people from the into the room now, Bikram.
Thank you, Nicky. I am Bikramaditya Choudhary, and I teach at Jawaharlal Nehru University, as Nicky has said. Let me begin with appreciating Rapid Transition Alliance, especially Nicky and Andrew, who have been I would say, more than active over last year and more during this period of pandemic, and looking after and looking through the possibilities that the world can gain in the process of imposed, say, if one use the word that different state agencies have used, of certain kind of lockdown and outcome of it in terms of halting production across different parts of the globe, including that in India specifically, which has more aggressive lockdown, which has impacted lives and livelihoods of millions all across the length and width of the country. And the world has seen the marching migrants across the street. So during that, and coming back to what the globe has done during the period, the reset the world, and the kind of initiatives and slogans. What we thought in working with Nicky and Andrew and with Rapid Transition Alliance, that what lessons that we can take for future if we have to look the world as a sustainable place for the current generations across the world, a kind of comparative understanding of the people across and the way they can sustain themselves and the generations that are to walk on the face of the earth. In that background, we thought that we will try to put up this particular discussion, which is a kind of a conversation where we have invited 4 or 5 speakers who will start the conversation, and then we will be joined by a lot of my undergraduate students and the research students, both to have fresh viewpoint and also their opinion on how they have negotiated with the world during this period and what they see future in the background of the political ecology, the human ecology, and the urban realities that I teach them. So I have asked a lot of my students to be here. So thank you all for joining, let me say that. And I would say that if I say that I want to put up a kind of a ball rolling with my understanding so that the speakers will have their own take on it, I would like us to discuss it broadly into 2 possible frameworks. One is definitely we live in a world which is led by production, or I call it a production of consumption. So we have the world where in a neoliberal corporate world, the corporate is not only producing goods and services and commodities, they are also producing consumptions by creating consumptive artifacts, or even the cities which can be consumed, the visuals, the multiple kind of what you call avenues, which are always something new than the existing, to allow a kind of wooing people to become a consumer. To the extent that currently the existence of people or the individual or the human being are only as a consumer. So you either exist until you buy or you don't exist. In that world, how do we survive, or what are the alternative models of part which I would like to say is an ethical view. Individual or collective or academician or activist group, what we argue about the consumptions which are led by the production. Kind of, I definitely am fascinated with the example that the world has celebrated. Kind of those 2 big business tycoon, or whatever the term that one wants to like, going in space, having fun and coming back. The amount of energy that get consumed in such acts, vis-a-vis when the million marched in my own country for their livelihood because the basic production activities were closed. How would we deal with both the reality that which world is better, seeing the Himalayas from say 150 kilometers during the lockdown, while millions are marching on a street in wants of food and say, basic sanitation with their kids on their shoulder or looking at it. So how do we try to engage with these kind of a diagonal or say multi-scalar binaries that we see across, and in that, how we situate sustainable consumption. That is the background in which I would thought to have a discussion. And I'm really thankful to on the panelists, Professor Ritu, Priya, Mehrotra, who we have been working for, say, last 4 or 5 years now on multiple initiatives towards sustainability, including different projects. Andrew, who I told that I have been, say, fortunate to have a multiple interaction during different regional and global conferences and such discussions and talks. Diganta Das, who is an old friend, currently teaching at Nanyang Technological University, who works on sustainability, primarily in terms of they are setting up a sustainability hub in their own university, and also working on water technology in India, looking cities from a point of view which goes beyond the existing theory of expanding or splintering and what is beyond. Dr. Jenia Mukherjee from IIT Kharagpur, who I have been in touch academically for now more than 2-3 years, definitely initiated with my one of the writing on Jenia and URM. And it has been nice to be in touch with Jenia on different kind of works that she does. And she works basically from a perspective where one can look at the nature from a political ecology perspective in the historical background, in the how the people and nature comes together, and how do they say shape the world as it looks today. And in that background, it would be good to see that how she situates her idea with regard to sustainable consumption. We have a couple of our old friends and colleagues along other than the students in the group. I can see Professor Dinesh Abrol, who we have been working for long. He's also part of TRCSS, and he has been a kind of a key cornerstone in our work at JNU TRSS in terms of doing sustainability. And actually, me being part of it, definitely the credit goes to Professor Dinesh Abrol way back in 2016 and 17. So he is with us today. He will be participating in discussion. And the next one we do on transport, urban transport, then we will have him as a panelist. Well, we will discuss case of one of our NCR cities in terms of what we can do for the transport. We have Marco, who I am thank you, Marco, for being part of it and agreeing to be part of the discussion. So we will call them for their opinion after the speakers. I think if I can invite Andrew to open the discussion, and then we go the list. Because Professor Jayati could not join because there has been a problem in terms of time. She is currently in US. She was supposed to come back to India, but she got stuck over there. And then the time has become that it is 3:30. So my apologies on behalf of Professor Jayati Ghosh. She wanted to talk the Club of Rome initiative and currently reading the Club of Rome in a current context. But somehow we will definitely have her on maybe next or maybe on 8th. So that's, can we call Andrew to start the initiative? I'm asking you, Andrew, because you have been part of such discussion earlier, so you can open the discussion, and then we will have other panelists to come up.
Thank you so much, Bikram. And it's really nice to meet everybody. And I'm sort of the least important person in this conversation because we desperately want to hear from your experiences from a different sort of global regional perspective, I suppose. So what I'm going to do is talk very briefly and very quickly about broadly what I'd describe as the European perspective or a European experience. So the context obviously is the climate and ecological emergency, the fact that we're living through a mass extinction event, already experiencing levels of greenhouse gases in the atmosphere which modern human civilization has never seen before. So we know that we need to do something different. We're aware that this situation has been created by a particular economic model, one which I would loosely describe as sort of debt-fueled overconsumption. I think what's important to think about and remember, though, is how incredibly recent this is. We only have to go back half a century to about 1960, when the levels of consumption which we were enjoying in the United Kingdom would have been able to be enjoyed within our planetary boundaries by the whole of the human population. Now, of course, it would take several planets to support the human population at the level of consumption that we enjoy in this country. And it's also important from an economics perspective for those students of economics here to realize that this modern model that we have was never in the original design. In fact, if you go back to the earliest teachings on economics from across the political spectrum, from Adam Smith to Karl Marx, both of them ridiculed the notions of consumerism, the ideas of flippant, superfluous overconsumption. And if you look at the kind of the big macroeconomic theories from the early days, there was always an assumption that a country would develop to a certain level where its basic material needs would be met, and then it would develop in other ways, in terms of its culture, in terms of the way that it lived in the world and enjoyed life. So these things were not in the original design, and they're also incredibly recent. And some of the factors were very specific to the post-war situation. In Europe, there was a lot of surplus productive capacity left over from the war economies. There was surplus oil. We were going through the wave of major discoveries of oil. That threw up a whole sort of era of disposability as plastics were devised as a way of using the surplus supply of oil. There were innovations like consumer credit, and then of course, a really important and current interest of ours, you had the model of consumerism massively promoted through advertising, through media. And this is an issue which Europe is looking at again now. And it's led us to this situation where the Earth, as the human population as a whole, goes into ecological debt round about the end of July in the year now. And the rest of the year, we're sort of using up our ecological capital. And the other thing to say about this model is that it's extremely odd, because all the research we have, and there's a lot of it, tells us that beyond the point where your basic material needs are met, we don't enjoy our lives anymore. We don't have greater life satisfaction, higher levels of well-being by having more stuff. All the research tells us that what gives us greater quality of life, once our basic material needs have been met, are being able to be active, being in a situation in which we're continually learning, having a culture which encourages us to take notice of the world around us, giving and sharing in our relationships and our local economies, and being able to connect with each other. These are the things which make a difference. But what we've seen over the period of the last 10 years, from the financial crisis and through the pandemic, that the drumbeat of advertising and consumerism means that we're still accumulating vastly more stuff. I find it particularly amusing that one of the few growth areas when our economy was doing badly, both after the crisis, the financial crisis, and during the pandemic, has been the economic sector of home storage. We are buying so much stuff that we've got no rooms left in our homes, so we're putting it into these big storage boxes and storage centers. I was also struck by the fact that much of the stuff that we think that we need to have, we barely ever use. It's a very peculiar fact, but if you think that on my street, probably every house has an electric drill. It's a peculiar fact that the average amount of time that an electric drill gets used is about 13 minutes. You might think, why have 50 houses with 50 electric drills when you could have one that we could all share? An odd fact, but there are strange things in the world of consumerism. Now, we know also that there would be no great disaster and no great radical human hardship through changing, because we've seen that if the richest 10th of the planet reduced its consumption to just the average EU level, it would cut global emissions by 30%. So we need to cut the overconsumption at the top where the overconsumption is happening. And we know that there will be a lot to gain from doing that. Now, we think there's now opportunities in the post-pandemic world. We our high streets are undergoing other challenges, and there's opportunities for seeing the green economy of recycle, reduce, repair, and share coming much closer to home. We've seen opportunities during the pandemic when people have got back to learning how to do things for themselves, maintaining things, making their own things, doing their own cooking, etc. So a different kind of materialism in which we have a healthier relationship to stuff. And the post-pandemic situation has shown examples of the way in which many people actually spent less money during the crisis, and we radically reduced our consumption, partly because there were shortage problems, but people still found ways to get through, and we developed other ways of creating our own entertainment, rediscovering our local green spaces in ways which benefited our sense of well-being as well. So we know that there are opportunities opening up as a consequence of the experience, however traumatic it was. And one of the things which I would just finish by saying is that one of the ways which we're now trying to address this is to change the cultures of consumerism that we live in, as if we live in a paint pot of just one color. So we're trying to do for the advertising and promotion of high carbon products, goods and lifestyles what was done in bringing an end to the advertising of tobacco and cigarettes when we understood that there was a public health cost to smoking. Now we understand there's an epic planetary health cost to our high carbon, high consumption lifestyles, and we're engaged in campaigns. You can see some of about that at a website called badverts.org, where we're trying to change the cultural environment in which we live so that we're no longer promoting high carbon goods and services. And if you want to see examples of the sorts of things that I've mentioned, please go to the Rapid Transition website, which is rapidtransition.org, where there are lots and lots of stories of how people have tried to live differently. And there are some background briefing papers on what we learned during the pandemic. And on that point, I will hand back over to Bikram. Thank you for listening.
Thank you, Andrew, for giving a perspective that currently Europe is dealing with in terms of negotiating the bombardment of advertisement, as well as, say, what we call the manufacturer consent and hegemonized individual who think that they exist because they consume. Moving forward, I think I can invite Dr. Jenia Mukherjee to bring to the perspective from what she brings to the how we look at the nature and what consumption does and how can it remain sustainable consumption. So Jenia, please go ahead.
Yeah, thanks Bikram, thank you very much, and also thank you for inviting me to be there as part of this panel. And I think I have been extremely enlightened by what Andrew has just pointed out, and also by his several works and the interconnection between this capitalist mode of production and the hyper consumption idols that are there, and how the views of the mainstream economists also remain extremely lopsided. So when I read the concept note I itself found very provocative, because it talked about how SDG 12 is actually talking in terms of promoting SCP, which is sustainable consumption and production patterns, but at the same time how uneven development and a whole lot of inequities and increasing ecological footprints are actually the order of the day. So what do we do? So how this transition from transition to sustainable consumption is actually possible, which is actually which should rest on theories or principles of equity and justice, where we'll be able to put people and planet before power and profit. So what should we do? What could be the pathways through which this can be achieved? So I think frameworks, mainly social sciences frameworks, or maybe transdisciplinary frameworks like political ecology and environmental humanities really have a lot of things to offer in this context. So long before, when I was studying at JU, and I was at the master's level studying history and specializing in environmental history, I came across a very interesting article by Carlos J. Castro, and this was published in Organization and Environment in 2004. And so in 2004, one can understand it's more than a decade now. It's almost 2 decades now. And Castro, it's a very comprehensive article because he kind of compiled several perspectives from both mainstream economics and also like perspectives and approaches coming from the post-structural scholars. And he talked about like, how this entire critique of, or how rather this economic mode of production analysis remains missing when we talk about decoupling environmental degradation from economic growth. So the whole idea is about like, when we talk about achieving environmental sustainability via efficiency. So the major problem or the major challenge associated with this is the issue of scale. We don't take into consideration how, the scale of resource exploitation. And I think political ecologists, they are really doing brilliant work in terms of, showing us how, the entire issue of scale is so very important in this very discussion. And what I would like to say is that, it's Andrew talked about Adam Smith to Karl Marx and how they really had critique over consumption. And like for a long period of time, there was a critique of Karl Marx himself by the environmental scholars who said that Marx was actually wearing ecological binders. But then the ecological Marxists like John Bellamy Foster and Richard York and Brett Clark from University of Oregon, mainly the team of environmental sociologists, they actually showed that how Marx actually talked about sustainability and how he said that the whole, the emphasis should be on stewardship and not ownership. So my final point would be, if we are trying to think of, or we are trying to think about how we can make this transition to a sustainable consumption by following the same old conventional economics paradigm, we are nowhere. And I would also like to emphasize on, this particular very interesting framework of Capitalocene, mainly by this historian called Jason Moore, where Jason Moore says that, Capitalocene is about, how we should be aware of the functioning of the capitalist engine in terms of facilitating or promoting the transgression of these 9 planetary boundaries. And my final comment for now would be that, long back in that very article, Castro talked about we need to emphasize on interconnectedness. We often forget that when we're discussing consumption, there are so many even micro actors who play macro roles, like microbes, like viruses, like coliform bacteria and whatnot. So I think it is important for us to accommodate, and in the language or in environmental humanity scholarship, this is known as entanglements. So I think it is important for us to also, focus on more than human entanglement when we are talking about consumption. So I think a lot of other things are there to be discussed, but we can take up things later.
Thank you, Jenia, for contextualizing it as kind of a fallout of capitalist mode of production, the current consumption regime, the way the world can say have at least a significant way to contextualize the ongoing processes all across. So thank you for bringing that aspect. With that, I think I will go straight to Digant, because I'm sure he will bring kind of a functional perspective that how the world is dealing, and especially his understanding of different parts of Asia, including Malaysia, Singapore, and India, which the 3 countries that he has been working for almost a decade. So Digant, it's over to you.
Thank you, Vikram. Thank you so much, and I appreciate for inviting me to be part of this seminar today. And again, thanks to Andrew and thanks Jenia for starting with the larger context of overconsumption that you talked about, Andrew, and the context of stewardship. Actually, that's very interesting to I guess what I'm going to talk about that is something from this part of the world, Singapore or overall Southeast Asia, but mostly I'll focus around Singapore's context of sustainability. As we all know, and as we all have experienced since last year, once the pandemic started, we realized that actually, and especially personally for me, I see that I realized that our needs are quite limited, and we are fine with that, even during the lockdown period. But we have absolutely unlimited amount of wants that we'd like to consume all the time. And during the lockdown, I realized that, well, our needs are quite limited and we are fine with that. And we can live with our limited amount of need in relation to our everyday life and basic everyday amenities. This is something that very, very interesting and kind of interesting for me to understand in relation to my family, our needs, and what our wants are. And this is something that I have been talking to my colleagues and my friends as well, to my family as well, that that in this world, the whole context of consumption and overconsumption is all about consuming. And as you know, that Singapore being a very ultra modern, or let's say hyper urbanization context, it also comes with a similar strong momentum of hyper consumerism. And this is typically, that's very much seen in other world-class so-called global cities as well. Consumption is primary motive of economic kind of activities in those world-class cities, so overconsumption to that extent as well. And this Singapore is not very different from that. The consumption pattern in Singapore is also very strong, and often kind of relates to the context of wants rather than need as well. However, what is very important is that the role of state also comes very strongly here. I mean, as probably you all know that Singapore has been Singapore's need of water is very much brought through the context of like water from Malaysia, and also reusing water through other kind of sources such as reservoir, and reusing water through rainwater and all sorts of things as well. So the context of water conservation and sustainable use of water has been very much there in the mind of people here. And often the state plays a very active and important role in relation to recycling of water, reusing of water, and sustainable water use in our everyday life. So people are quite kind of aware about water and scarcity, as well as water as a resource in Singapore. However, since the pandemic, I think there is another context that came in very importantly, and that's food. Singapore being a small country, but at the same time, our food waste has been nearly 665 tons. That is the food waste for a population of nearly 5.6 million, 5.6 million population in Singapore. So, and what happened is that last year, when the pandemic happened, there has been a huge supply chain disruption. Singapore does not produce its food. Most of its food comes from outside, imported. And this is where, when the supply chain disruptions goes in, and that actually realized that, well, I know how to create a sustainable food network within Singapore as well. And Singapore government actually came in with the context of 30 by 30. That means by 2030, 30% of food need of Singaporeans will be met through local agricultural production in relation to protein, production in relation to vegetables, and other kind of things. I think we have a very small amount of land dedicated to agriculture, but now more and more kind of like emphasis is given towards technocentric urban agriculture, urban farming, as well as sending seeds to every household to create garden farming as well. The idea is that not only water, but food is also very important in relation to a sustainable use of food or sustainable production, and being self-reliant, at least to some extent, given the context of disruptions and supply chain as well. So I think these are the contexts that have been very, very kind of ongoing in the larger kind of debates around sustainable consumption in Singapore for quite some time now, since last year. Water has been there as a part of it for quite some time. Beyond this, actually, I would say that as the reduce, reuse, and recycle, there is one more phenomena that is coming up, emerging, is repair. So as you know, that this overconsumption is also about not repairing, right? Anything that breaks down, you just try to, like, buy a new one. For example, Singapore, being a near the tropical area, fans, table fans or ceiling fans, whenever there is it breaks down, people used to buy a new one, right? This is a typical kind of consumption pattern, and companies are very happy about it. But now there is a huge emphasis by National Environmental Agency that we need to repair and reuse it. So there are certain kind of, like, we call it repair kopitiam. Kopitiam is a local name for coffee. So in a way, like, repair cafes, where there are repair gurus who will actually come and actually inform young kids, young students, how to repair their, or actually people, public as well, how to repair their, their electrical fans or other instruments, and they can actually reuse it for quite some time as well. So another way is kind of, in Indian context, we call it jugaad, right? And this is happening. So I think what is more important here is that educating our next generation in relation to how we can reuse, reduce, or repair, and lengthen the context in relation to consumption, and also to be aware of what's happening around the world, supply chain disruptions, being resilient as well. So I think the role of state, as well as educating our future generation, is very important, and that's where I connect to the Genia's context of stewardship in relation to sustainable education. And that also connects to Andrew's ways of looking at overconsumption and the context of, like, what is our need and what are our wants, and often they are very, very more as well. I'll stop it there as well. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Digant, for bringing a kind of a perspective which you have brought from Singapore, and then trying to connect it to the larger idea of resilience, and also, say, educating future generation. It's important to definitely take these into account, especially the idea of stewardship, and also at some point of time looking at the failure and success of the idea of stewardship, especially in terms of that what we call is what you have rightly brought in, the role of a state. That different state, when they are competing in terms of becoming, in terms of achieving higher growth rate, higher than A or higher than E, and then 205 countries, especially India being, say, the country where Gandhi lived his life, fought for it, and died for it, and brought this idea of stewardship. And the way we are, say, becoming kind of a society where the identity is more based on the capacity to consume, rather than, say, what India was known for, say, kind of at least proclaimed emphasis on spirituality vis-a-vis the so-called Western way of life, where materiality is more in favor of, so the materiality take precedent over spirituality. And in that debate, that future generation and stewardship, which can be situated and also debated, and definitely today, the good part is that we have a lot of young minds. So let us, we will definitely go to their comments and hear them or read their questions. How do they see the kind of generations which will, say, be instrumental for the earth, say, after maybe a decade or so. But before we go to that, let me invite Professor Ritu Priya Mehrotra, who have worked for long in Delhi and around in the NCR region, dealing with issues of environment, sustainability, health. She's basically a public health professional and a trained doctor. So let's hear her that if what perspective that we can get with the consumption, and definitely the kind of global emphasis, and definitely the successive WHO report on lifestyle disease, quote unquote, and that lifestyle which is driven by consumption. So, Professor Ritu, Priya.
Thank you, Bikram. And it's been very interesting listening to everyone on this issue. I really want to see it from the experience we have in India of both overconsumption, but also underconsumption, which is a large part of our story. And therefore, the overconsumption and underconsumption are two sides of the same coin at one level. Because it is, if one uses Gandhi's oft quoted one, there is enough for everyone's need in this world, but not enough for anyone's greed. And therefore, how do we see, those of us who are over consuming? And when I say us in this, looking at it again from the India lens, one would talk about certain parts of the world where overconsumption is much more in proportion to we place ourselves in the low and middle income countries, and where the consumption levels are not as much as of the high income countries, but also that within the country we have the disparities very, very markedly, and the whole issue of two sides of the same coin. Now, one, of course, in that it becomes an economic issue, an issue of distribution of resources and so on. But looking at it both from, as Bikram said, I work with public health and with urban sustainability. And it's from these examples that I will try and illustrate the issues that I want to highlight, which are basically two or three, if I may. One, that while political ecology and if we bring in social justice in terms of these two sides of the coin, is about distribution of resources, what has created this kind of uneven distribution of resources and overconsumption on one hand and under on the other is, to my mind, the development models developed over the 19th and 20th century, which somehow we now seem to take for granted. And they therefore create the need and the perception of need well beyond, and which in some societies would still be called greed at another level. So what is it that defines need? To me would be something we'd have to look at very crucially, and everybody is referred to that in terms of the basic material needs being met, and then it's other things than consumption, than material consumption that brings about better quality of life. But if it is the kind of development discourses that we have, and I just take maybe example of healthcare, if you will. The blueprint of healthcare that we've all had in our countries of a doctor and hospital-centered model of what is healthcare. And the fact that, where is the questioning about everybody being able to access doctors, access medical care? Of course, everybody across the globe must get them when they need it. But the way we structure our systems for it is something which does not allow that universal access at all. And we can keep it as a slogan, we can put it in our sustainable development goals. But our notion of what is need is the doctor and the hospital. That's the popular imagination of healthcare, which, at least what the last century of development has shown us, is not attainable for all. Whether you look at the kind of costs that go into it or the human resources that go into it, despite our having a blueprint at the 70 years ago, 75 years ago now, when we gained independence and attempted to develop a very vast network of public systems. So it's not the private sector only that we talk about in this case, but in developing that public sector system, we skewed it completely to tertiary level hospital care, developing doctor in the name of providing equitous, best care to everyone. And so this notion of what is best, I think, is something we need to question very centrally if we are to look at what is overconsumption. Because none of us would question the fact that, of course, there must be fully trained doctors, which, at least in the Indian context, is 5 years of training. In other countries, it varies a bit. We had 3-year doctors at that time, and our blueprint, in the best wisdom, decided that that was not good enough, and we had to have 5 years. We had to have more medical colleges and so on. Therefore, every village does not get healthcare. The hospitals take up all the funding and attention, because you need the good doctor before you can create the primary health center where he is to sit, or he or she. And therefore, it skews the whole path of healthcare development. So we today have a path dependency, where everybody wants to go to the specialist, not even the GP doctor or the graduate doctor, but everybody has to have a specialist now as close to them as possible. That's become a popular imagination, and that we found COVID very clearly showed us the flaws of that. In the COVID pandemic, the whole imagination again was ICUs, ventilators, tertiary hospitals. And then comes the vaccine as the panacea for prevention. None of these seem good enough to save people from either getting infected, the vaccine doesn't, or the ICUs, ventilators were really not what were required. What you required for at least 80-85% of people was primary level care, or contact tracing, testing, isolation was primary level care. And many of our countries had given up our primary level care and given up public systems for private sector care. So this is the corporate capitalist development of health sector in the last 20-30 years at its best or worst, whichever we want to see it as. And that meant a lot of loss of lives, which may have been saved if something like this pandemic had happened, let's say 20 years ago, when public sector was better equipped and we had more primary health care at a level in terms of imagination as well. So this process of relying on only the best, and this applies whether for human resources or for technologies and so on. And so, I'll rest that issue there. I hope this example illustrates for us the point, and we can get much more into that. And I'm sure everybody can think of their own examples on this. The second is the relationship of, and this also does illustrate that as well, production and consumption, and how the production process shapes consumption. We have our example again, very, which is well known, and therefore I'm referring to it, the food consumption and food production and consumption cycles, where we depended on the Green Revolution for ensuring better nutrition to the country as a whole. And we still have at least half our children undernourished. A recent analysis by students in our center has shown that the macro data sets we have from the 1990s onwards actually show a decline in adult heights in the Indian population. It's something that's not the experience of anywhere else in the world, at least from where we have data. But in the Indian population, we're getting declines in height as an average. When we've done Green Revolution, our godowns are overflowing with grain and so on and so forth. So the whole, I'd just like to cite what the Right to Food campaign has been advocating for a long time. Not only that we had the right to food legislation, which can be enforced to ensure that everyone gets food, but also that it must ensure that the model is such that local production of coarse grains and other traditional foods is what is used for public distribution as well, and so provides the farmer with price on which to work and provides locally produced food at prices which would be easily affordable for everyone. And then move on to, there will be parts of the country where you don't produce enough food, and then you of course get it from elsewhere and so on. And that's part of the role that the state must perform. But this model is not what the corporate and the green revolution kind of technologies for agriculture support. And so when Digant was speaking about Singapore, it put a little bit of scare and shivers down my spine, because Singapore often is now in India providing models for our future. And we don't have the problem of land in the way that Singapore does, but we'll adopt the models of technology, because that's what our politics of knowledge has moved in that way. That the best technology is the one which is the latest, and the ones which high income countries and those urbanized like Singapore and so on are the ones they adopt. And therefore, if we start doing that, that will be in the absolute opposite to what the Right to Food campaign has been asking for. So I think, stop here with this idea of development models and the kind of technologies we adopt and how we adopt them being completely crucial to this agenda that we're talking about. Thanks. You're muted, Bikram.
Yeah, no, I'm not. Am I muted?
Now you, yeah, I can now hear you.
Oh, sorry. Yeah. So thank you for ending at what we call theoretically, what we call is a policy mobility. Like the policies are framed elsewhere and then transplant elsewhere. And especially Singapore has been kind of what we call is a champion of exporting policies elsewhere. And definitely that one of the, I would say, it may be premature to say failed project, but definitely one of the halted project of policy mobility, that was creation of Amravati as a new capital of the newly created state. And me and Digant were trying to work on that, what kind of a city making that we are going to have it in terms of creating kind of the land that this city has acquired for itself, whether we need such an amount of land in an agrarian hub of that particular coastal belt to create a capital as of today, or is it better to have a land somewhere else where we do not harm the interest of what we call is a food production and food consumption. So thank you for bringing that perspective. I'm tempted to have two discussants, maybe partly if we can call, or their opinion, Marco and Dinesh, but let me go back to Nicky and see that if there are questions already, or should we take a question first, and during that we ask these friends to give their viewpoints. So Nicky?
I think it's great to go to them first, actually. Bikram, yes, if we get the some input from Marco. And
okay, so if you say that, then let me start with Dinesh. I can see Dinesh and Marco both are here. Marco has shared a paper which I will definitely share with all the participants after the event, and definitely we will be discuss that. So okay, let me have first the voice, let me hear first Marco, and then our own Professor Abral, he's there. So Marco, can you give your brief opinion? In between, I would request all our other participants that you can write your questions in the chat box, and then you can ask yourself if you feel like. If you want to ask straight the question, you can just put your name in the chat box so that Nicky can invite you by name. Yeah. So Marco, can you come
Yes.
up? Yeah, please go ahead.
Yes. Thank you so much for convening the meeting and invitation. I think already we see that JNU again has a lot to offer for the world. That the background note, I think, really touched on the heart of the matters and the discussions so far as well. So maybe I start by quoting TikTok. My daughters are actively using that. They have shown me a slogan from there that under capitalism, there's no sustainable consumption. And I think this was a message also from some of the speakers today. So the question then comes that what to do with capitalism then, and why there's no sustainable consumption under capitalism. And I think one has to do with the necessity of expansion, that in order for the capitalism to sort of keep going, there has to be expanding spaces, and the one articulation of that is the economic growth. And this is why I have been quite active in the European degrowth movement and degrowth, let's say, learning, where this is taken as a sort of starting point that if we want to have a sustainable society, it cannot be growth obsessed or bound to growth. And another dimension has to do with power, that often we are called that we live in democracies, but if we look at it more carefully, I would say that we live in plutocracies, where the rich and the capital has disproportionate amount of power. And one sort of expression of it are the income differences, that we have the super rich, and we have still, though decades of developmental discourse and policies, we still have the people in absolute poverty, and that has to do with power. So there, the alternative to capitalism would be real democracy, where people would have equal say, and then that would result in more equal distribution of incomes as well. And one more thing on incomes also, because I think for the rich it's not possible to consume so sustainably, that if you look at any data sets, then the incomes, be it national incomes or personal or household incomes, they correlate very, very strongly with environmental harm. So this is what Andrew mentioned also in the beginning, that actually the rich are maybe the number one environmental problem that we have, or at least what solutions in that direction should be there. And finally, to conclude, two more points. Like advertisement is of course then one which keeps this expansionist machine going and should be discussed much more in the sustainability context. And then finally, point on climate policies, like how this skewed discussion of consumption versus production has been, I think, very, very, very harmful. That 40 years when climate policy was first framed, then it took the consumption end, the emissions end, that in Rio Convention 92, the climate convention, emissions were the focus. But if we would look at the production, then of course the extraction would attend and would deserve much attention, because I mean it's a flow, it's a cycle that starts from the extraction and ends up as an emission. But I think it was very purposefully designed by oil and other fossil fuel interests in the end of 80s and early 90s, that it's harmful for us if there's a regulation of extraction, but it will not have big difference if there's regulation of emission. And this is how the climate policy has been done for the 30 years. We discuss emissions and they keep growing, and extraction is hardly discussed. Even rich and green country like Norway, continuous extraction, because that's what in capitalist modernity any sensible institution would do. But thanks so much, and happy to be part of the conversation.
Thanks, Marco. Let me straight go to Dinesh Vag. Professor Abroad? Yeah.
I belong to a generation whose public life began sometime in late 60s, 70, 71, early 70, you can say. I have experienced that there was a political discourse at that particular point of time linked to self-reliance, Indian independence, decolonizing ourselves. And we had accommodation of a number of perspectives: Nehruvian perspective, Gandhian perspective, left perspectives. And I think that particular politics allowed us to pursue a pathway which allowed independence on the one hand. We wanted to decolonize ourselves, and as a result, certain kinds of technologies were required to be mastered. At the same time, they were to be used very carefully in a sustainable manner, was also the understanding at that particular point of time. Like the question of handloom must coexist, power loom must coexist with, or natural fibers must coexist with man-made fibers. So the nature of production or the development model, there was uncertainty about it. What would, finally in terms of make its way forward, in terms of even, capital was not very sure about it. The business groups were not very sure about it. They had interest in all types of fibers as far as it's concerned. But subsequently, of course, man-made fiber grew as well. Similarly, even in food, you had coexistence of variety of systems of production and technologies as far as it's concerned. But when India experienced PL 480 linked humiliation, and when there was a food shortage, and which was a result of the colonial period, where it had emphasized cash crops and food crops were not emphasized. So you got to then ask the question that the models which got chosen, why were they chosen? Because if in 1948, the Higher Education Committee report we look at, which is what dealt with how actually we should be developing our local economies and rural economies, it had a very different model. But by the time of early 60s, the models changed. So that politics of it is what we need to really understand, and what were the sources of it. There is not only capitalism, there is also imperialism. So, and the anti-imperialist struggles, when were taking place in this country, there was a challenge, because it was being done under a capitalist mode of production. The big business grew. Then it sought for internal liberalization to begin with. Then it sought for external liberalization in order to expand itself, because it wasn't able to accumulate. Then came the influence of the finance capital. What I'm saying is we should identify the forces. We are identifying ourselves as consumers, but actually people who are producing consumption, who talk about where Bikram said, but who are these people? Finance capital, big business. Why it is they who choose, and contesting their politics, whether the Indian politics of the period can be analyzed here, while we are really wanting to way forward. And I think that's where the focus will have to come. At the moment, I don't think we discuss enough about politics. That who stands where, which class, and including the United States and UK, where when they are talking of transition management as far as it's concerned, whether it is green capitalism, and in which there would be still very much extractivist politics, which they'll continue even as far as red and various kinds of things, commodifying everything, capitalism continuously penetrating, and subsequently putting pressures on us to liberalize more, continue to integrate areas which were not yet commodified and also become object of consumption. That's the case which we see. So I think let's understand that the politics of production will have to be analyzed before politics of consumption can be actually changed. That is where the focus of attention must now be directed to. Thank you.
Hello. Yeah. Hello.
Yeah, we can hear you. We can hear you.
Yeah. Okay. Sorry, I just got my screen got frozen, so I was not sure if I am audible. So thank you, Dinesh bhai. Let's take a certain question. Nicky, you will lead that.
Yes, no problem. Well,
Yes.
we've got unusually shy participants today, which is not usually my experience doing events like this. So I've put my own questions in here, and I see now somebody has actually responded. Thank you. That's really nice of you. So Prashant Kumar has said, how do we make people consume less when their internal voids are filled up by owning more and more stuff at least for instant gratification? And also refers to the advertising as a major problem. I don't know whether Prashant would like to unmute and speak to us about that directly. If so, then please do. If you don't want to, that's fine, and we can just ask the panel to.
Prashant, do you want to speak yourself?
Yes. Hello.
Hi there. Hi.
Hello, ma'am.
Hello.
Actually, I wanted to ask in context of like online marketing, like we see seasonal flash sale when the teenagers are surrounded by all ads that if they don't own that product, there is something lacking in their life. So in that context, I wanted to ask this question.
Thank you. Did you want to ask it to anyone in particular?
No, ma'am.
Okay. Would anyone? I don't know whether Diganta.
There's a hand. There's a hand raised.
Oh, good.
If you take both the questions together, there is a hand raised. There, I think I can see one hand. Yeah, there's a Milind. So, should we take the question together?
Yeah.
Yeah, Milind, what's your question?
Good afternoon, everyone. I hope I am audible to everyone.
Yes.
My question is that in the current state of policies, like we are seeing here that the corporates like good multinational companies like Google and Facebook, all the social media networking sites are aiming at people, targeting the population so that they can consume more through the advertisements. So in this current context, can we say that the state should come up and regulate all these policies so that we can pave our path towards a sustainable consumption?
Thank you very much. That's another great question. Should the state be playing a much larger role in helping us to counter some of the effects of capitalism? So we've got what do we do about advertising, particularly online, forcing us to consume more, and should the state be playing a larger role? Could I ask which of the speakers would like to respond to that? Calling Singapore.
Yeah, Digant.
Thank you. Thank you for the questions. Actually, I think both the questions are almost similar in relation to the larger context as well. It's about consumerism. Very interesting questions, but very hard to answer, right? I mean, given the fact that we are part of this generation where advertising and targeted approach in relation to our everyday life is all around this consumeristic culture, and I think I'm also like it's very difficult for me to stop myself from buying or clicking, especially in our smartphone, and ordering the next stuff. But I think what is more interesting and important is actually to be responsible consumer. I guess being responsible consumer doesn't happen in one single day. I think this is very important that perhaps for me, at least, I could say that I'm more aware of what I consume. I'm more aware these days, in recent time, I would say, that what I consume, I'm more aware of what I need, and I only try to consume what I need mostly for my family, for myself as well. I think after some time, all these advertisements and all sorts doesn't really impact me much now. I think this is something that we need to do at personal level, is basically to be responsible at personal level and to be a responsible consumer. Again, coming back to this context is also about a collective responsibility, and I think the state plays a very important role as well. I think often what I came with this example before as well about repair gurus and repair co-PTM. It's nothing but a collective responsibility. Collective responsibility in relation to that how we can reuse our materials. I think it's a Jugaad context as well, how we can lengthen the life of some of those utilities that we use in our everyday life is nothing but a collective responsibility of a society. And I think we need to come up with these initiatives more often, individual responsibility as well as collective responsibility. I think this is kind of a small answer to the question, perhaps from my point of view. I'll be very excited to hear from my colleagues here.
Nicky, maybe I can come in and venture something which is a bit difficult for somebody like me who's done medicine and then come into public health and policy kind of issues. But what I can clearly see and saw even more when I was trying to understand in the 90s, 80s and 90s really, the HIV pandemic. The fact that you have what Diganta called responsible consumerism was responsible sexuality in that context and in that discourse. But in all of this, there were issues and cultural differences of cultural ethos, of extent of consumerism, of consumption, whether it is material consumption or it is relationships and sexual relationships, of what is allowed and what is not allowed culturally. And that puts barriers of a kind which is not only economic. It certainly comes from subsistence economies, because India had a subsistence economy earlier. You needed to have cultures of self-restraint. Today, we seem to think that we have more than enough out there. It's only for us to grab. And therefore, the cultural context is completely shifting. But the fact that one would have to have, as Dinesh Brol said, systems of production, but production and consumption as economic entities is not devoid of the cultural context. And I think we'd have to look at the cultural context much more, because in our development paradigm, we've completely ignored that dimension. And we are finding across the globe, the rightist forces take over in that sphere very easily. And the cultural right and the corporate capitalist frame are very neatly coming together to advance consumerism more and more. So how do we, look at this entity, which is cultural patterns created by cultural contexts, and where in that does something like, austerity is not a good word, because in the European context, that means public sector decreasing anything. But in the Indian context, austerity means that you reduce your material needs to the basics and move in a different direction for development and quality of life, which is what Nicky and Andrew started with in the beginning. So I just want to flag that that's an important area which we'll have to deal with, whatever its challenges and it's the double-edged sword that cultural entity can be. But if we don't engage with it, then we leave it open completely to others in the field, which is going in the corporate direction. And India is an excellent example to show us that. So I'll just stop at that. But I hope that for those who ask the question, that, how do they in their generation start dealing with issues of austerity and self-restraint on consumption is a big challenge, because as they pointed out, not just advertising, but the entire economic paradigm is in the reverse direction. So yeah, I'll just leave that as challenges really, and not have any final answers on that, but just to flag the issue.
Yeah, if I can just add to ma'am's comment. So I think if the younger generation, our generation and also the younger generation, they become more aware of the challenges or of the problems associated with this hyper consumerism. I think we will start taking small steps at least to restrain ourselves. So, for example, I was just going through the data to see, to find out that in the last few decades, I think two or three decades, how the poultry sector, how production in the poultry sector, it has increased like anything.